company of Mr. Akbar. We met briefly in Toronto, and whose book is part of the reason I'm writing my next book, which is titled Jinnah's Orphans. And that's what I'm researching in Delhi and Dhaka now. I take a slightly different view of what is ailing us, and I lay a lot of blame on some of the victims of terrorism who are reluctant to call a spade a spade. Terrorism by its very nature is not new. I mean, 19th century saw enough terrorism in Europe by the anarchists. The French Revolution could be, it's filled with massacres and wells filled with nobility of the French. Europe is not immune to terrorism. I mean, we have Subhash Chandra Bose's ideas of fighting for liberation. We have, in Parliament in Lahore being attacked, Lala Lajpat Rai's association with Bhagat Singh and all that. The difference is that if the Sandinistas are committing an act of terror, or if Che Guevara is blowing up bridges, or the Vietnamese are disrupting French lines or American troops, or let's put it somewhere closer to home, if the Tamils are committing acts of terror in Sri Lanka, all these forms of terrorism have a goal, which is a stated, whether you agree with it or not, the program of establishing something for an idea or a nation state. So when you have many communist uprisings right around the world, or you have, for example, even if you look at the Khalistan movement, the goal of establishing a state for the Sikhs, you always find an objective, which is, whether you like it or not, a possibility that can be accomplished. Terrorism is not new. What has happened is, and what is different, and what I find people very reluctant to call it, is Islamic terrorism. So we use the terminology, and in using the terminology, we lose our ability to address the problem. What happens is we say terrorism is a scourge, and so then we have to involve all acts of terror. But if all the Tamil tigers were to succeed in being the worst forms of terrorism, then all that would happen would be Tamil Eelam in the north and east side of Sri Lanka as a separate state. That's the worst aspect of it. In many other places, whether the East Timorese or the Kosovars took up arms, or whether it's the Darfuris who demand freedom from Arab Sudan, there is an objective that says, this is what I want. What is unique about Islamic terrorism, which is rooted in Islamofascism, which is rooted in the works of Sayyid Qutb and Maududi and Hassan al-Banna, and which is a very 20th century concept, is that it is demanding nothing except death. That is so fundamental in trying to tackle this, is that if a Kashmiri wants separation, he is demanding, whether you like it or not, an independent Kashmiri state. If somebody is fighting for the liberation of India, whether it's Bhagat Singh, he's giving his life for something. Today we are facing a scourge in which the objective is death itself. None of the 9/11 bombers, or the Boston bombers, or the two Toronto guys who wanted to blow up a train over the Niagara Falls, or everyone who has come out of Pakistan in the last 20 years, almost all the terrorism that you see is rooted in Pakistan. You need to then address the question, why is it rooted in Iran or Turkey or Indonesia? Are there less of Muslims? I haven't heard of, in fact, the first Palestinian that I've heard of in international terror is the Toronto guy. I've never heard of them. Their terrorism is, or their, if you call it acts of terror, are for an objective. These fellows are pursuing a political ideology which I'm afraid is a death cult. And unless we address it specifically and address it saying what is the way to destroy this cancer, instead of going through the route of asking the dumb question of what is at the root of it. Last week I wrote a column, and so my suggested title was that it's the doctrine of jihad, stupid. Because if Obama has the audacity to say, we are trying to understand what is this root cause, then Obama himself is complicit in the acts of terror. Because the inability to speak the truth with clarity at a time of war is an act of betrayal. And ma'am, you keep mentioning that acts of terror were committed against India. I would hope one day you stand up and say there were acts of war committed against India.
You have said it.
But you are reluctant. That's in your politeness and in the inherent decency of the Indian discourse. Sometimes Mr. Akbar is less, he's more forthright than many Indians when they address this. But there's a reluctance to call a spade a spade. What exactly is the attack on Bombay or Mumbai? Is it not an act of war? So why is it being called an act of terrorism? You can say that the 9/11 is an act of terrorism, but the attack on your parliament is not an attack, is an act of war by the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. It is your response, or rather I would say the inability of India to respond, is what is fueling this terrorism. So as unpopular as I may be in saying that, I lay it at the feet of the United States of America and India for their inability to show any character, fortitude, and spine that can be erect when they say, well, the Chinese can come in 18 kilometers, they didn't come 20. I'm embarrassed, I'm flabbergasted that any country, not even the Maldives, would allow a wave to enter 18 kilometers in and not have an emergency launched in the country. And the United States of America ends up with a Secretary of State whose Deputy Chief of Staff is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, raised in Saudi Arabia, whose mother sits on the Central Committee of the Muslim Brotherhood, along with the wife of the President of Egypt. And all you can say is, well, Michelle Bachmann is a right-wing idiot. That's the only response you have in response to Huma Abedin carrying the most secret elements of American foreign policy. So why are we blaming or crying foul when we do not have the strength to face the war that has been launched on us? Imagine 12 years after 9/11 that somebody can come to Canada and try to blow up a train on top of the Niagara Falls. Can you imagine Nazis getting into Canada at the height of Hitler's power to blow up a train? Would you have accepted the notion that's not German attack on Canada, it's an act of terror? The post-1990 world that we live in which the Cold War has ended and the Soviet Union and communism has collapsed, I believe has left us unable to understand the cost of appeasement when we do not have the ability to stand up and speak the truth, for fear of being called right-wing, for fear of being said that you are a member of the RSS or BJP, or I don't know how many things I was called today at the JNU, for simply saying that the attack on Mumbai is an act of war, and the inability of the Republic of India to even send a destroyer to patrol the seas of Karachi confirms the propaganda to be the truth in Pakistan, that India is a bunch of cowards who are only interested in trade, money, and plasma television sets and expensive cars. You don't hear that at the exchanges of NGOs that you meet over there, because everybody wants to appear very polite, very accomplished, very intellectual in a discussion. The hard facts are that are people dying. In Pakistan today, you have the Balochistan war, which I never read about in Indian press, whether it's the right wing or the left wing. I don't even hear about it, as if that part of the world never was part of India. I never hear about what is happening in Sindh, because it seems all of India is concerned about is the Muslim Punjabi who speaks Urdu and is ashamed of his language, or the UPites who you sent to settle down in Karachi and destroyed Sindh's capital where no one speaks Sindhi. Between these two, you study the elections and say, well, what's going to happen to General Musharraf, what's going to happen to Imran Khan. Other than that, I don't know anyone knows that in the frontier province, which is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which I would hope every Indian would know, because that's where Bacha Khan came from, that's where the Congress won, that's where the frontier Gandhi was, that's where people are being assassinated every day by the Taliban. And that's where the election will be determined, not in who wins in Pakistan, but if the secular nationalist government of the ANP is toppled over there. And what happens in the election in Balochistan? 10,000 guerrilla fighters under an urban middle class Dr. Allah Nazar fighting for that. And you have the port of Gwadar sold to the government of China. So the problem then is that in a democracy where you can speak, and nobody speaks that the ambassador of High Commissioner of India in Bangladesh was attacked in a attack. I couldn't see it on the front page. Imagine if the American ambassador to Bangladesh had been attacked. There's just no coverage. It's too far away, but still an Indian High Commissioner. So if in a democracy, if where you have the right to speak and the ability to speak without fear, Islamic terrorism and jihad and Islamofascism is not called by its name, and the notion that Pakistan can somehow be traded with and civilized and brought as a member of the nation state is so absurd, because if Pakistan was to be a mature nation state and friends with India, then it would cease to exist as Pakistan. Its reason to exist is to be anti-India, but to be more specific, anti-Hindu. Its notion is that, its premise is that we are the chosen people to rule India, and there was a glitch somewhere in between in 1857, and we'll sort it out, and Mr. Jinnah will create a territory from which we will assemble and then retake Delhi. If you think that is not true, and if you think this is absurdity or I'm being unnecessarily hawkish, then what exactly is the problem of General Musharraf not coming back and settling down in Delhi, which is his birthplace? Can you imagine him doing that? He won't. Because deep in his mind, the intelligentsia and the politicians, other than the Balochistan frontier secular nationalists, who are the only Democrats, by the way, only people touched by the Indian National Congress or the Communist Party of India, who sacrificed and given a lot, who know what it is to fight for democracy. No one else is doing that, and they feel abandoned. If there are people who took part in the genocide of Bangladesh and were colonels and generals and brigadiers and owe their freedom to the Indian Army for not having been charged for war crimes in 1971, where do the rest of us go? Where do the people of Shahbag in Dhaka go when they go around and look war criminals walking across? And the only place they can look for is India. And in Calcutta, you have 50,000 people coming out to support the Jamaat-e-Islami.
Yep.
Where is Jyoti Basu and his 30-year-old communist regime? Is to support Islamism? I refer to this as Sharia Bolshevism that has evolved in the Indian and the American left, where those who could have spoken the truth have today been addicted to an anti-Americanism which is so popular that you can't go wrong if you attack America. You can't attack China. But I asked someone, has America come 18 kilometers into India or has China? They don't have an answer, yet this fundamental problem that Pakistan poses as a state based on the two-nation theory and the absurdity of the two-nation theory, as long as there is no recognition, as long as you are interacting with Pakistan and never demanding of asking the question, have you yet found out or discovered that this theory of two-nation theory is fundamentally, it's an anti-Hindu theory. It's not two nations. What it is saying is that we are too good to live with the Hindus and we've ruled them for 1,000 years and therefore they deserve to serve us. This is what is being taught to us, the generation that Rushdie calls the midnight children. This is what we were taught, the Bhuka Bengali and the dirty Hindu. It was acceptable to tell us this day in and day out till people revolt and say, I'm not going to be part of this nonsense. So if we are talking of terrorism, please call it for what it is. It's an act of war, and if it is terrorism, it's Islamofascism. It's an act of war considered by non-state actors in some parts of the world, but specifically in Pakistan, it's a state acting through the ISI. It is a state acting through the military-industrial complex that relies on the Indian bogey and anti-Hindu propaganda to hate the Hindu, not the Sikh, by the way, because there's fundamental arrangements made in the mindset as to how to use the Khalistan movement to weaken India and bleed India. The whole notion of 1,000 cuts is there. But if you are not going to demand this as a basis of your relationship with Pakistan, then you have nowhere to go. And there is no progress going to be made, because Pakistan is not just a country, it is a state of mind. Because if it was a country, that country would have Dhaka as its capital, because it was only Bengal that elected the Muslim League in 1946. Sindh, you had to buy GM Sayyid. In Punjab, Muslim League was not in power. In Frontier, the Indian National Congress had a government. Balochistan, by the way, was an independent country in 1947, August 11th. Invaded by Pakistan 9 months later in a massacre of the ruling family. And the trouble at that time was Mir Ghoswas Bazinjo, the leader, the parliamentary leader, was a Central Committee member of the Indian Communist Party, and the Americans and the Brits were freaking out that the Red Army was so close, and if Kalat becomes an independent state with Khair Bakhsh Murray and people, Marxists and communists in power, what's going to happen? All those things are lost when you do not put your foot down to say that a state that sponsors an act of war by supposedly non-state actors is committing an act of war against a sovereign state. As long as you don't respond to that with firmness, I'm sorry, your Lok Sabha is going to be attacked again and attacked again and again. And I think that it is not non-state actors who are doing this. This is being done by the Pakistan military-industrial complex. It is funded by the United States of America. Somehow, knowingly, unknowingly, there's billions of dollars pouring into that situation. And if the ANP loses in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Taliban will be running the government in Kabul in 2014. If the secular nationalist ANP manages to retain power, then you have some hope. If Ataullah Mengel's son, Sardar Akhtar Mengel, wins an election with compromises in Balochistan, then you have some sense of hope. If it doesn't happen, then you have an act of war going on in a very sensitive part of the world. Huge area, very rich, and right on the mouth of the Straits of Hormuz, with the port, with nuclear, with submarine bases in the hands of China, not Pakistan. Thank you very much.